Well, good afternoon, everyone, and welcome to the webinar titled, How Can SLED Tech Vendors Adapt and Thrive Amidst the COVID-19 Crisis? My name is David Heineman, and I am the CEO of Segis Group. This webinar is intended to help technology vendors adapt to the current and near-term selling environment in the state, local, and education markets in the United States. We'll be referring to state, local, and education using the acronym SLED, S-L-E-D, throughout the presentation. We'll accomplish this today by combining the experience and knowledge of three organizations that gather data to help IT vendors make an impact in the SLED market. Segis Group, the premier provider of SLED technology opportunity market intelligence. Power Almanac, a leading provider of contact information for local government leaders, influencers, and decision makers. And Grants Office, a leader in providing federal and state grant tracking programs, particularly those involved in SLED Tech funding. I'm joined today by Ron Mester, the founder and CEO of Power Almanac. Welcome, Ron. And Michael Paddock, the founder and CEO of Grants Office. Here's our agenda for today. We'll have a few housekeeping items that we'll talk about, and then we'll look at the impact of COVID-19 on SLED Tech budgets, then look at how agency programs are positively impacted by COVID, how they're negatively impacted, how agencies and vendors can capitalize on federal funding and grant programs. And then we'll talk about how buyer-seller dynamics have shifted and changed, and we'll answer some of your questions. First, a couple of housekeeping items. All attendees are muted. If you have any questions, please submit them via the chat dialog box available on your screen. We'll try to save 10 to 15 minutes at the end of the presentation to answer questions, and we'll get to the ones that we don't answer during the presentation individually. Finally, a recording of the webinar and a copy of the presentation will be available on the three websites for the organizations that are sponsoring this webinar: CJISgroup.com, PowerAlmanac.com, and GrantsOffice.com. So let's get started. I guess we'll start with the bad news first. State budgets will take a hit this year and for the next couple of years as well. Sales tax and income tax revenue shortfalls are the primary drivers of these budget deficits. However, as this chart tells us, while large, these deficits are not order of magnitude different than those deficits generated in the Great Recession. That said, the federal government should be able to fund these shortfalls through relief programs targeting states, and the legislation being considered over the next few weeks in Congress will have a significant impact on these state budgets going forward. Just as the virus has not impacted all states equally, all states are not equally prepared to handle a budget shock. In particular, tech vendors should be aware of the budget reserve shortfalls in Florida, New Jersey, and Illinois, three states that have been heavily impacted by the virus and are not well capitalized for a budget shortfall. COVID-19 may have a more severe impact in those states. Let's look at some of the SLED IT COVID impact themes. I think number one, and I'll have to admit I borrowed this from a CIO presentation that I heard last week, is people will be getting online, not in line. Remote communication technology will be one of the solutions used to eliminate lines or crowds or gatherings in offices. More agencies will be using web portals, digital signatures, etc., to accomplish tasks previously requiring in-person visits. Number two, budgets won't be thrown out of the window, but you must keep yourself informed about shifting priorities due to budget or personnel allocation changes and changing policies and emerging issues. Now, here's another item that I borrowed from a CIO, mobile first. All applications need to accommodate mobile devices. They are the most pervasive endpoints we have and the best way to make services available, particularly to underserved communities. Tracking, tracing, and identification applications will be in high demand. These applications may range from statewide COVID tracking systems to personal COVID status identification that you may carry on your phone, like a mobile boarding pass in your Apple Wallet. AI will accelerate, or the use of AI will accelerate due to the sheer momentum of COVID-related data flow. And by momentum, I mean the mass of data and the speed at which it's processed. The number of government offices is likely to fall, but spending allocated to make them safe and allow social distancing will increase. There may be needs for thermal imaging, to take people's temperature, or when you check into a government office, you may have to reveal your COVID status. These are applications that are very much in our near future. One interesting observation is that local government budgets will be less impacted than state budgets. Ron Mester will be going into that later in our presentation, but sales taxes and income taxes really don't affect local budgets. Underserved communities, at times the hardest hit, will be allocated proportionally greater resources. We're talking about schools in low-income districts, aged populations, rural areas, corrections facilities. We as vendors should be looking at identifying opportunities to help agencies dealing with underserved communities in their situation. And finally, governments want or need partners for bold initiatives. It's your job to partner with SLED agencies to create innovative solutions. Let's look at the agencies that or technologies and programs that we think will be positively impacted by our current situation. No doubt, education, while not positively impacted, the solutions to the negative impact of COVID-19 are almost all technology driven. I know that I'm not revealing any great news to you here. This is a little bit of motherhood and apple pie, but we're already seeing massive ramp-ups in purchases of laptops. You should keep your eye on the E-rate programs. Education will be a hot area for adoption and augmentation of technology. Of course, health and human services, ranging from telemedicine, thermal imaging, and a bunch of legacy systems. The unemployment system in the state of New Jersey got overwhelmed. A lot of these legacy systems will need upgrades and replacements as states and localities struggle to provide services. And on the enterprise level, broadband infrastructure is more important than ever. many areas, like rural areas, need to find creative ways, possibly through public-private partnerships, to improve broadband access in those areas where otherwise it may not be commercially viable. We haven't even begun to address the election issues that will crop up, and technology is likely to be involve one of the solutions. Cybersecurity is always an issue, and without travel, without trade shows, video and web conferencing become even more important. Finally, in the public safety arena, drones, thermal imaging, and tracing solutions will come to the forefront. Now, these may be obvious, but together they capture replacement acceleration, social distancing, and virtualization and safety precautions, all that have come to the fore and will require technology solutions. I want to show you an example of a recent RFP put out by the DC Department of Health. This is an example from our CGIS group database of a disease investigation contact tracing application. This is one of the first of many that we expect to see out in the market, and you need to keep your antenna and use your market intelligence tools to maintain your awareness of these opportunities. As another example, Yes Prep down in the Houston, Texas area is an open enrollment public charter school system serving students in grades 6 through 12 in what are largely underserved communities. They just put out an RFP at the end of April for 7,000, what I would consider pretty significant laptops. We're expecting to see much more of procurements like this over the coming months. At CGIS Group, we're constantly talking to IT people, technology people, and related decision makers, and what we're told is that previously slated or budgeted items have been put on hold. People are distracted and had not been pushing out as many RFPs for technology. We saw that through April, but in the first week of May, we saw an uptick in RFPs back to what we would consider normal level. And that is good news for us. Agencies are realizing that technology is a key component of solving any COVID-related problem, and they're starting to open up the RFP faucet again. So what are the key takeaways? One, all budget programs in government, technology programs are being reassessed. You need to know where you stand with these new priorities. What's been delayed? What's been canceled? What are the new opportunities that are coming out there? You need to be tuned in, and it's difficult when there are no trade shows and you're not traveling. You need market intelligence tools. For us as technology vendors, COVID-19 probably will accelerate technology adoption and innovation, and likely present more opportunities than less for us. Again, with no trade shows or travel, market intelligence can be the key to identifying opportunities. Use your tools well. With that, I am going to turn it over to Mike Paddock of Grant's office to talk about funding in this environment. Mike?
Thank you very much, David. I appreciate that introduction. So, hello, everyone, and thanks again for joining us. So, I'm going to just talk briefly today about some of the COVID sort of stimulus response funding that we've been seeing coming through over the past several months. Keep in mind that the funding itself actually has been distributed through 4 different congressional bills, the largest and most grant forward being the CARES Act funding. So there's a fairly significant amount of funding being distributed in addition to what is typically distributed on an annual basis. So we see the funding is a little bit different. This emergency funding is a little bit different in the sense that whereas annual funding usually involves a long game strategy and overall improvement of the organization, the stimulus funding is primarily for immediate and emergency response to the crisis, something that needs to be spent over the course of 12 to 18 months at the most, in most cases. In annual grants, the applications are typically lengthy and they have narratives that are based on the project plan, itemized budgets for planned expenses, etc. In the emergency grants context, the applications are typically brief and they require just agreeing to a litany of regulatory references that you probably would have to Google in order to understand. The award decisions in an annual basis can take anywhere from 2 to 8 months from the deadline. In the case of these emergency grants, funding decisions are being made quickly, sometimes within days. And then lastly, the reporting process for normal annual grants, which still represent, by the way, about $600 billion a year in funding for public sector organizations. In those annual grants, the reporting occurs generally between 1 and 4 times per year and focuses mostly on progress toward the stated objectives of the project. In the case of the emergency grants, the reporting occurs more frequently, sometimes monthly, and focuses mostly on the proper use of those funds. So let's go to the next slide and start looking at some of these different funding opportunities. So the first one is the Governor's Emergency Education Relief Fund. In total, it's about $2.9 billion in total funding. This funding is being distributed out to states, and then the governors are given a fair amount of flexibility in terms of how they want to distribute those funds for emergency educational purposes. It could support K-12 initiatives, could also support higher educational initiatives. Some states have begun to come out with guidance for school districts and higher education institutions in terms of how they should be using those funds, but that information is still ongoing. And that's going to be kind of a running theme through a lot of the things we talk about here today, is that there is a process by which the states determine how to redistribute these federal funds. And some states have just been faster than others at making those decisions. 60% of the allocations that states are receiving will be based on the relative population of individuals that are younger, aged 5 through 24, and 40% of the basis is going to be on the relative number of children that are counted as low income, K-12 low income, and neglected and delinquent population. So similar to what they have to use for their title fund applications. And so this alone is a significant opportunity. We've calculated a total addressable technology market from these stimulus funds of about $10 billion in total. Now, not all of this stimulus funding is going to be going for technology, certainly. Some of it may go toward staffing, some of it may go toward backstopping other expenses. But nevertheless, there is, especially because of the role technology has played in both telework, telehealth, teleeducation initiatives that most of these public sector organizations have taken on, we're expecting a significant amount to be spent on technology. So the Governor's Emergency Education Relief Fund, kind of the first one that we're looking at. The second one, if we go to the next slide, is the Elementary and Secondary School Emergency Relief Fund. This is a $13 billion program, and the funding is going first to state education agencies. That money has already been allocated to those state educational agencies. So we know that the states are ready to start regranting those funds down to the local level. The states are required to regrant 90% of the funding they receive to local educational agencies. And local educational agencies here means public school districts, charter schools, most public educational entities at the K-12 level. There may be some additional funding for non-public schools through the public schools in a similar way that non-public schools currently receive funding through title funds. They receive their allocation of title funds based on their student populations, and they're received from the local school district itself. So private schools can get a share of this, but they're going to get it through their local school districts. Much like how it was determined how each state would receive funds, the local educational agency allocations will be based on the same math that is used to determine their Title I funding. So, however, Title I school-wide schools and districts with those school-wide schools, the highest percent of students in need, low-income students and disadvantaged students, are going to see a bigger funding allotment than those school districts who serve students who are more affluent. So just be aware that that's how those funds are being distributed. And again, some states have decided the exact calculation they're going to use to redistribute those funds. Other states have not. So we're very much in a time of potential. The funding has made it to the states. They're getting ready to redistribute those funds down to the local level, but they have not yet made decisions across the country about how those funds will be redistributed, which means that local educational agencies that are in line to receive these formula funds, including both of the programs we talked about, the Governor's Emergency Education Relief Fund and the Elementary and Secondary School Emergency Relief Fund, will be receiving, and that's every school district across the country is going to be receiving something from this program. They're still determining how they're going to spend those funds. What does that mean to you in working with and providing support to school districts across the country? It means that they're going to have a significant budget. What they're going to need to know is how to articulate their technology projects and their specific projects in a way that fits with the requirements overall of this funding. Let's go on to the next slide. In addition to these formula grants, there is also $307 million that's being split between two programs. One for state educational agencies, the Rethink K-12 Education Models grants, and that program is going to constitute $180 million. And they have three priority areas: providing funding through micro grants that allows parents to meet the educational needs of their school-age children through increased access to high-quality remote learning to support educational needs. And also the second priority, development and expansion of high-quality course access program or a statewide virtual school. And these course access programs would have to enable students to select from different courses that are offered by any public school in the state or even by third-party providers, regardless of the student's assigned school. Those virtual schools would allow flexibility for students who may have difficulty accessing or attending brick and mortar schools, especially given the widespread number of school closures that we've seen. And then the third priority of this Rethink K-12 Education Models grants is that states can propose their own educational strategies that demonstrate a rationale that's supported by a logic model and to address the specific educational needs of their students as related to remote learning. The other program is a workforce development program called Reimagining Workforce Preparation Grants. And this is also going to go to states, although the states are likely to share the funding with workforce development stakeholders across the states. And of course, we know that workforce development projects are by their very nature collaborative. And so it's going to be post-secondary four-year colleges, community colleges, other workforce training service providers, as well as the participants in workforce training. That's going to be your local workforce investment board that works with unemployed or underemployed individuals, as well as high schools that are going to be sending students out into the workforce. So both of these programs are very technology friendly in the sense that while states may not choose to use all of their funding for technology, we do expect to be that there will be a fair amount of that's integrated into these programs. The deadlines are expected by the end of June. The programs haven't been announced yet. We were actually expecting them to be announced at the end of April, but they have not yet been announced. And so we're expecting an end of June deadline. And the link there is the kind of link to this page on the Department of Education's website that shows more information about this program. Okay, let's go on to the next slide and just talk briefly about the healthcare sector, also another sector that's been heavily funded in these stimulus response programs for obvious reasons. Healthcare has not only seen significant decreases in revenue and have had to, in many ways, transform their approach to providing healthcare services from an on-site physical approach to more of a virtual telemedicine approach. And the costs that are associated with that. So we've seen increasing demands on the healthcare sector, as well as the lost revenue that many healthcare providers have experienced as a result of, reductions in the kinds of elective surgeries that they can no longer provide because they can't have patients in for that. So in any case, there's a few programs just to touch on here. The Provider Relief Fund is a big block of money that is distributed to the healthcare organizations, $100 billion in total. So far, $30 billion has been sent to the two hospitals based on their 2019 share of Medicare claims. So hospitals were able to calculate that and determine based on their share of the overall national Medicare claims, which I think was about $430 billion last year, how much they were going to receive. An additional $20 billion is being sent to hospitals based on their 2018 net patient revenue. And then another $50 billion targeted to specific areas, high impact areas, those that have been the most impacted by COVID, and for reimbursement for treating uninsured COVID patients. We saw an additional amount of funding in the latest round of stimulus funding that has actually increased the total amount of unspent healthcare dollars in this program up to $140 billion. So there's actually even more than that that's going to be coming down to hospitals and health systems. Some of the areas, and we'll talk about this again in just a second, but some of the areas that we're seeing receiving significant amounts of funding are in areas where they don't get a lot of attention because they generally don't have a lot of budget revenue. Rural areas and tribal areas where you may not have seen a lot of business there, but we're expecting these to receive significant allocations of some of this funding. And then the FCC telehealth program is a $200 million program. They started accepting applications earlier in the month, and they're accepting applications on a rolling basis, unlike most grants, which have a firm deadline. These applications are being accepted on a rolling basis until the funds are exhausted. They've already administered nearly $25 million to 56 different organizations. It's a very technology-friendly grant program, funds telehealth initiatives, everything that's associated with delivering patient care through telehealth. And it may become an annual funding program. It was very popular among hospitals and health systems. But there's still some of that $200 million available, and hospitals and health systems are still developing applications for those. And then lastly, the USDA Distance Learning and Telemedicine Program got an additional $25 million for operating a second round of the so-called DLT program. This funding is for either distance learning projects or telemedicine projects. It doesn't have to be both, primarily in rural and remote areas. So you have a hub and spoke kind of model with these DLT funds, where there's most commonly an urban or suburban provider of content, whether it's distance learning content or telehealth content. And the recipients and users of that are in these remote and rural areas where they can't afford to have, say, a cardiologist on staff at their local hospital, but they can consult with a cardiologist or have a cardiologist do some telehealth services for those rural hospitals from their remote area in an urban or suburban location. Or from a distance learning example, we could imagine an instructor of Chinese in an urban or suburban school, providing Chinese instruction for students who want to take Chinese courses but can't. The school district couldn't afford to have a full-time Chinese teacher. So those are the kinds of examples where we see the distance learning telemedicine program. This is an annual program that's funded every year at about $25 million. And this is just going to be another round of funding for this program. Okay, let's move to the next slide. Moving right along, we're talking about, billions upon billions of dollars in funding, and we only have a few minutes to talk about it. But so I want to give you the high-level overview of what's happening with some of these funds. And the short answer is, if you're feeling like you might be missing something, chances are you're really if you keep your ear to the ground, a lot of this stuff is making its way right now to the states and to the local recipients. So we're still very much in the middle of the process of distributing and spending these funds. In fact, most places haven't even really started spending these funds yet. They're still in the process of being distributed. There's a Treasury Department program that allocated $150 billion to states and territories. Each state receives a minimum of $1.25 billion, very broad in terms of what these funds can be used for. They can be used for personnel. They can be used, again, to backfill expenses that have been accrued since March 13th, since the national state of emergency was declared. And in general, these funds can be spent up through September 30th of this year. So these funds are going to be spent fairly quickly. Let's move on to the next slide. And we have some law enforcement funding, $850 million being distributed in a very similar pathway to the way that the Burn Memorial Justice Assistance Grants are distributed, which means that the largest municipalities are going to receive a direct allocation from the Department of Justice of that $850 million, and the smallest jurisdictions are likely to receive funds through their states. In all of these pass-through programs, which nearly all of the programs we've talked about so far are pass-through programs, the states are going to have a certain amount of control over the priorities that those grants can be applied to and how the funding is distributed. So unfortunately, from our perspective, or fortunately, it means that instead of having one single point of funding like we would see with a typical grant program that went directly to local recipients from a federal agency, we see these funds as being 57 times more complicated because there are 57 states and territories, each of which are receiving these huge influxes of funding, but nevertheless are also using their own processes to determine timing of the grants, priorities that the grants can be applied for, and the application process for each one. That's going to be true not so much for the direct allocations for these law enforcement grants. Those are going to go directly from the Department of Justice to these large municipalities. But for the smaller municipalities that are going to have to access funds through their state, some states are holding more competitive application processes. Some states are more formula-based. And so you'll want to be aware of how your state is distributing those funds so that you know what to talk to your customers about what, how they should access those funds and how they can leverage them to move forward with the projects that they want to move forward with. And then lastly, just a quick note, if we want to move to the next slide, just a quick note on the tribal law enforcement grant. I mentioned that tribal entities are receiving a big chunk of funding, in this case, $400 million just for tribal law enforcement. It's going to be distributed through again, a similar kind of application process as we see with the so-called CTOS program, the Coordinated Tribal Assistance Solicitation, which means it could be used for a whole range of different types of projects and programs, from law enforcement technology in those tribal areas and information sharing, as well as for, say, domestic violence enforcement, for new programs for the community. So the tribal law enforcement grant, just an example of how tribal entities are receiving a significant share of funding through this stimulus funding as well. Everybody's going to be getting a share of it, and it's going to be coming down through either a combination of competitive grants, in which case the message to the customer is, hey, here's a grant you can apply for. If your project is a priority, let's talk about how we can integrate this into a grant proposal. And formula grants, where the message is really, let's package up this project we've been talking about and write it up so that there's a narrative component, there's a description of what the project is, what sorts of needs it's going to address, and what the budget is, and run it up the chain to the department leadership and task force individuals, who may also be made up of department leaders, who are making decisions about how that funding is being spent. So just a quick overview on CARES Act and stimulus funding, so you are aware of it. We're happy to provide more information and support at Grants Office, and we'll look forward to working with you going forward. With that, I'll turn it back over to David.
Thank you, Mike. Really appreciate that good information. There's a lot of pieces, and you've brought it together well in a very digestible way. With that, I'm going to turn it over to Ron Mester, founder and CEO of Power Almanac, talk about how this affects you, the vendor, and your interaction with the customers. Ron?
Thanks, Dave, very much, and thank you all for being here and joining us on this webinar. You know, at Power Almanac, our primary work is providing resources to companies like yours to do the marketing that you do to these agencies. And one thing that we've heard over and over, certainly recently, is with all of this change going on, your go-to-market plans have been disrupted too. They've been disrupted because of squeezed budgets, not just the squeezed budgets of the agencies, but in many cases, your marketing budgets have been squeezed. They've been disrupted because of canceled conferences and canceled in-person sales meetings. And they've been disrupted because your staff and the prospects you're trying to reach are working remotely. Those things together all mean that there's very little chance to meet with people in person. And on top of all of that, there's so much noise to overcome in the system right now. And your prospects, your customers are getting a lot of things thrown at them, a lot of messaging from multiple directions, not just from suppliers like you, but from other places. And of course, your own team members are also being overcome, hit with a lot of noise. There's a lot of noise to overcome. So just an additional comment, if we can go to the next slide, about the loss of the consequences of losing in-person contact. Of course, that means for many of you, not all of you, but for many of you, reduced lead flow. Many of you generated leads through your in-person contacts at conferences or sales meetings. But on top of that, it means reduced visibility into upcoming projects and RFPs. Of course, you can still rely on services like the market intelligence services from CGIS Group to get that kind of visibility. But before, you had the visibility from meeting with people in person and asking them about what's coming up, asking them about the RFPs that are out there. And you don't have that in-person visibility anymore. In addition to that, the agencies, their awareness of vendors and solutions out there is less, again, because of the reduced in-person contact. Many of these agencies rely on going to that exhibit hall at the conferences or in a series of meetings over the course of a few months to get to know vendors and solutions better. They don't have that. And less in-person contact means less trust. It doesn't mean they're literally not trusting you. What it means is there's less opportunity to build trust, to build rapport, to build credibility. And that's an important thing to keep in mind as we start focusing on how you might change your go-to-market strategies. And all of these things together means something very important to also keep in mind, which is there's an increased advantage to incumbents. So if you're the incumbent in a particular agency, you're probably in a stronger position now. But if you're trying to unseat an incumbent, it was always difficult. It's probably harder now, and that should also make you think a little differently about how you go to market. So if we can go to the next slide, I just want to summarize the 4 things that we believe you should do quickly to adapt and thrive in this marketplace, given those kinds of changes that are going on. 1, shift your target market priorities. 2, reposition your products and services. 3, expand your marketing outreach. And 4, rethink communication tactics. Now, I want to talk about each one of these 4 things in a little bit more detail and get specific to give you some ideas to walk away from this webinar from that you can begin to implement. Let me first turn to number 1, shift your target market priorities. The first thing I want to talk about here is think hard about shifting more of your resources, attention, and focus to local governments as opposed to state governments or education or some other areas. Not to say that all those areas are still good markets for you, but we've done quite a bit of analysis looking at this, and we've concluded that local governments are likely to be less hit or hit less hard than state governments are. If you were to go to our blog at poweralmanac.com, you can find an article and an analysis showing more details. I've just picked one of the charts that to demonstrate the point. This particular chart here shows sources of revenue, with the blue bars being sources for state governments and the gray bars being revenue sources for local governments. And the hardest hit sources of revenue are likely to be sales taxes and income taxes. And you can see here that state governments are far more reliant on those 2 sources of governments than, of revenue than are local governments. And so this is just one of the pieces of evidence that we looked at in terms of looking ahead over the next 12 months and trying to understand which government budgets are likely to be hit the hardest. So think very seriously about how you might put more emphasis on your local government marketing, cities, counties, and towns across the U.S. Let me go to the next slide. And continuing on this topic of shifting your target market, there are important thing to keep in mind is that there are likely many more users for you to, or let me say this differently, there are more decision makers involved in the process of buying technology, and more of those are users and less of them are the IT professionals in these governments. Now, in local governments, the purchasing power for technology decisions, even before the COVID-19 crisis, had already been shifting away from the IT department towards users. We know that because, first of all, only 25% of local governments even have a head of IT. And so automatically in those cases, the primary users within these governments, the heads of departments, the heads of public works, the police chief, the fire chief, the head of finance, and so on, are going to have a very substantial say in what kinds of technology they're going to buy and implement. But also just the broader trend of cloud computing works towards empowering primary users. We believe that this trend, which is already happening, is going to be accelerated by the COVID-19 crisis that's currently happening. It's going to be accelerated because there's heightened urgency to make quicker decisions, and the primary users of software and technology are typically in a position or driven to make decisions faster. They feel that urgency. And secondly, IT departments in this environment are going to get very quickly overwhelmed. So keep that in mind as you think about who you need to focus on. I'm going to come back to this point in a little bit. If we can go to the next slide, that would be great. So again, in terms of shifting your target market, you want to make sure to focus on the end user in the upper left-hand corner. You want to make sure to focus on the executive buyer up there in the upper right-hand corner. That would be folks like the city or county managers, because they are going to need to be executive sponsors, especially if end users get more involved. You're going to make sure you want to focus on the economic buyers, That would be the end users themselves, and then, or the heads of purchasing, or in some cases the heads of finance. And you want to still maintain focus on the technical buyer. The mistake that we've seen made even before this crisis is an overemphasis on the lower right-hand corner and ignoring of the other three types of decision makers in this process. And now with this crisis, it's going to become even more important to keep all of those decision makers in mind. Moving on to the next slide. The second point is to reposition your products, and mostly we think this has to do with your messaging, but I'm going to say a little footnote on that here in a moment. So in terms of your messaging, number one, focus on solving the agency's must-haves. Now, those must-haves right now will include some things that may seem more obvious, like helping them provide safer environments and helping them ensure that citizens in their cities and counties are being compliant with the social distancing rules and so on. But there are a number of other must-haves that local governments need right now. They need better ways to engage with citizens. They need to figure out better ways to save money. They need better ways to increase productivity because they're going to have to do more with less moving forward in light of some of the budget constraints that they'll be working under. They need better ways to help their own employees work effectively remotely. So there are a number of must-haves. Think about your product or service and make sure that when you talk about it to your prospects, you're really emphasizing how you can address a must-have, at least one of those must-haves for a local government. The second thing is add or enhance a freemium offer, if at all possible. Many of you have freemiums already, make it better. If you don't have one, add one. This is going to help you help the governments make a quicker decision to give your product a try. It's easier for them. They don't have to make an upfront financial commitment, and they can immediately begin to see how your product and service works. It's a great way to build trust and credibility when you can't meet with them in person. Emphasize the ease of use and reliability of your product because remember, many of them, if not all of them, are working remotely. And so making it easier and more reliable is going to be more critical than ever. And wherever you can, highlight case studies that are specific to COVID-19 so that your relevancy seems immediate. And last but not least, shift your sales pitches to offers of help. Right now, that's going to play better. Now, the little footnote I want to add here is that if your product just simply doesn't address a must-have or is just not easy to use, you may want to seriously consider some hopefully quick product development efforts to add features or to make some adjustments because those things are going to be critical moving forward and certainly over the next year. Moving on to the next slide, the third item is to expand your marketing outreach. I want to talk about that in two buckets. The first one is cast a wider net. This is a natural follow-on to what I was describing before with all of these types of decision makers, end users, executive buyers, and so on. Make sure that your marketing reaches out to all of them. You want to build your brand, build awareness of your solutions with all of these decision makers, not just any one of them. The second thing, the second set of things, if you can click again, is use multiple channels. So I suspect that all of you are using at least one of these and probably several. Take a hard look and see if you can add more channels. If you're not using LinkedIn or other social media, do it. If you're not going to online forums or professional associations, add those. Inside sales or old-fashioned telephone calls can be an excellent way. The calls might be short, but an excellent way to reach folks right now and to get across what you need to get across. Webinars, pay-per-click, quick note on pay-per-click, your keywords may need to change in light of the current environment, so take a hard look, make sure you're doing the right analysis there. There may be partner companies, other suppliers who perhaps in certain areas or with certain governments have higher degrees of credibility than you do right now. Maybe you can partner with them and get them to promote what you're doing as a way for you to latch on to their credibility. Email campaigns is always one of the most effective marketing tools. It still is. In a little bit, I'm going to talk about how you might want to rethink some of the content there. And last but not least, certainly market intelligence tools, again, like the kind that that the CGIS group offers, could be very effective. So definitely think about how you might use all of these channels right now to help you cut through the noise in the marketplace. Let's go to the next slide. So, quick note on using these channels. Each of these channels have some peculiarities that relate to local governments. And so in this particular case, I'll focus on LinkedIn. We did a study of the presence of senior local government officials on LinkedIn. You can find that study and more details about it again on our blog at poweralmanac.com. And what we found may surprise you, which is that even amongst these senior executive decision makers at local governments, in many cases, a very small percentage of them actually have LinkedIn profiles. The second thing to understand is that the variance between different positions, fire chief with 35%, top appointed like city managers at 73%, is substantial. So know who you're trying to reach and understand what the potential but also the limitations are of each of the channels. By the way, on LinkedIn, best way to find profiles is not by trying to use titles, because titles are problematic with local government officials. Best way is if you can have a name in advance and find the name and find the profiles that way. It makes a huge difference in being able to get to those right people. Let's go to the next slide. We asked 12 local government marketing experts for their advice, and that's another blog article that you can find on our blog, summarizing all the advice that we got. I wanted to just hit on some of the key things that came out of that research that we did with that panel of experts. Really boils down to rethinking your communication tactics, and again, I'm going to talk about that in two ways. The first is rethink what you are communicating. Is it valuable? Don't send them fluff right now. If you can't immediately see why this is valuable today, rethink that message. That goes for email marketing and any other kind of marketing. Second, is it actionable today? Local government officials are not thinking about tomorrow. They're thinking about what they need to do right now. So have you given them something they can act on immediately? Again, back to the freemium idea, that could be very powerful fit with this. Is it snack sized? You've got to get to the point faster. That's going to be absolutely critical. The second set of things I'd like you to think about is to rethink how you are communicating. Are you doing something that would heighten anxiety for these local government officials, which right now they don't need? You may think not, but a lot of marketing and sales pitches are focused, for example, on scarcity or urgency-based appeals. Act now or we're going to run out, or first 10 to sign up get this discount. Those kinds of appeals can increase anxiety. Not a good time to do that. Are you being memorable? You can do that by being very creative and setting out extremely different kinds of messages. Fantastic if you know how to do that. You could also do that just by personalizing. Being personal is memorable. 3, are you listening? Yes, send your messages out, but find ways to engage in two-way conversations as well. That could be by phone, but that could also be by participating in online forums that are provided in some of those channels that I mentioned earlier. And last but not least, small detail here, but maybe an important detail, is this the best time to be sending out the message? You know, normally there's certainly been a lot of studies over the years about best times of day and best days of the week to send out, for example, email messages. But some of those quote unquote rules are different right now. A lot of local government officials may not be working for parts of the day during 9 to 5, and they may be doing more work in the evenings and the weekends. We've actually had a lot of feedback to tell us that that's the case. And so some of your messages, where in the past you may not have sent them out at 8 p.m. or on a Sunday, you might want to do that quite specifically. I certainly wouldn't recommend phone calls during that time, but other kinds of messages, again, like email marketing, that may be a great thing to do. So long story short, rethink your go-to-market tactics, and there's a lot of opportunity to be successful still in this market. Dave, back to you.
Thank you, Ron. Great summary there. Let's go over some of what I believe are the key points, and pardon me for reading, but I think we'll be pretty succinct. The budgets, state and local government are down, but technology is key to solving COVID-19 issues. There still will be plenty of opportunity. Projects are being reprioritized. You need to be aware of these schedules and get updates on a regular basis. Know how your solutions will be used and where they stand in the prioritization stack. Funding will be there for key initiatives, and you need to help the agencies navigate the funding maze. Mike has given us really great information there on that. Sales and marketing tactics, as Ron said, will change, and of course, you need to adapt. And emphasizing local decision makers using appropriate channels is key. And be a partner, not a vendor. Last week at the NASCIO CIO conference, I heard this again and again. Our vendor partners, our partners, have some empathy. It's something that's lacking in certain quarters these days. Finally, we've kind of run out of time for questions. We will answer all questions individually as they've come in. I want to thank you all for attending, and feel free to contact any of us at Segis Group, Power Almanac, or Grant's office for further information. Thank you. Good luck in your selling efforts, and may everybody stay healthy. Thank you again.